My name is Mariko Chang, and I'll be moderating this next session. So this summit is structured around new and groundbreaking research that quantifies the drivers of the black-white wealth gap. Now, while of course each community of color is unique and has its own challenges and strengths, we anticipate that much can be learned from the racial wealth gap for communities of color by understanding better the dynamics of the black-white wealth gap. Now, our nation clings to the belief of equality of opportunity, and we are reminded often in the media, perhaps not ironically, of examples of people, men, women, people of all different racial and ethnic backgrounds who have made it, overcoming seemingly unsurmountable obstacles. We celebrate their success, but we as a nation have turned a blind eye to those who are working just as hard, if not harder. Our nation tells them they can achieve financial stability, if not financial abundance, if they work hard and if they play by the rules. But our nation's historical legacy of racial inequalities and our current policies and discriminatory practices slam the door of opportunity closed. Social inequality is not new, but as we will learn, it is spiraling and becoming more entrenched every day, touching more and more people and widening the chasm between the haves and the have-nots. Communities of color are disproportionately affected. The recent recession, for example, hit almost all families hard, but communities of color were clobbered. Between 2005 and 2010, the typical white family lost about a quarter of its wealth, but the typical family of color lost about 60% of their wealth, doubling the racial wealth gap during this period. But these dramatic differences are no accident. They have deep historical roots, and they are reinforced by policies that subsidize, give free stuff, subsidize asset building for those who are at the top. And at best, they thwart asset building, or at worst, strip away the asset building opportunities for those with the least financial stability. In my work, I've used the term wealth escalator to represent the many ways that the labor market, the tax policies, and the structure of government benefits limits women's ability to build and hold on to wealth. But many of these same structures that comprise the wealth escalator limit the ability of communities of color as well. Many of the mechanisms, however, remain invisible, they go unchallenged, or are simply accepted as the status quo. It is our job, the people in this room, to challenge and change the status quo. It's not just a matter of fairness anymore, but our nation's future depends on it. We must learn from the past to create a more equitable future. On that light, it is my profound pleasure to introduce our two panelists today, two pioneers in the field whose research laid the groundwork for understanding the causes, the consequences, and solutions to the racial wealth gap. Tom Shapiro directs the Institute on Assets and Social Policy and is the Pokros Professor of Law and Social Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy and Management at Brandeis University. With Dr. Melvin Oliver, he co-authored the award-winning book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, and more recently published The Hidden Cost of Being African American. Barbara Robles is an economist and the senior research liaison at the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. She is a co-author of The Color of Wealth, The Story Behind the Racial Wealth Divide. So, you are both pioneers in the field. You've articulated how people who have assets can hold on to those assets and the consequences of that. Can you share with us your lens, research, and analyses, and how it's evolved over time? Can you tell us about the critical lessons that you've learned that led you to our understanding of the racial wealth gap at this moment?
Sure. Let me take the first crack. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I'm the guy with the impossible expectations. up here, meant to tell you all about what the drivers of the increasing wealth gap look like. Let me tell you how I got there. In the fortunate opportunity I've had to do a lot of writing and talking to media and to general public and lots of audiences, it's amazing to me that I seriously can't think of one occasion where data around what the racial wealth gap is has been challenged. It's unassailable, and I think that we have built that foundation that nobody has attacked because, frankly, it's very, very difficult to attack. However, just as Alexis told us before, it's like a racial Rorschach test. When I talk about the racial wealth gap, everybody knows why that gap exists. Because, in fact, it builds into all of those implicit biases, and that social construction comes back at us. And you hear that in all kinds of ways. As I've been thinking about that, I've been trying to work on a project that tees up some evidence-informed policy at the same time that helps us shape an evidence-informed narrative that accounts for the largest pieces of the racial wealth gap, in particular, the largest drivers of the increasing racial wealth gap. Because I think we all do understand that, in fact, when I give you the data that will say the racial wealth gap has increased $152,000 over the last 25 years, in fact, just about every single thing somebody could think about is going to explain a part of it. $152,000 is a huge bleed, and all cuts lead to that bleed. But it's our job, and what I've tried to take on here, is to get at the most important, the key drivers of that $152,000 increase, and to put in perspective all of those so-called popular narratives that might explain a nickel of it. So, typically, I'm not sure where the sun is shining brightly on us, perhaps glaring out some of the slide here. But typically, when we look at the racial wealth gap, we look at it at one point in time. And we see data like this, which is accurate, absolutely accurate. And it tells us that the gap is somewhere around $100,000. And we talk and think a lot about why that gap exists. And when we think about it at one point in time, we're looking at one bar in time, our brains, as they should, I think, go to the historical, the legacy, the sedimentation of inequality, because we're talking about a starting point, in a way. The perspective that I want to start to shift is when we ask the question, what happens over the course of a generation to that gap that we typically just look at one point in time? And here I don't know how clearly, again, people can see it, but the blue chart, the blue bars, the blue lines, is median wealth of a typical white family. The red is typical wealth, the median wealth of an African-American family. This comes from a study, panel study of income dynamics that has followed the same set of families, and we're looking at it over a 25-year period. And what I think is really critical for us in terms of how we move forward, both in policy development and in shaping our own narrative, is to ask two key questions. One, what accounts for that increasing space between the blue and the red line, between the median white family and the median African-American family, where that gap has basically tripled in real dollars up to now it's increased by $152,000 over the 25 years. And second, to ask, are the accumulators, the drivers of wealth, do they reward African Americans, and I think it will also apply to other minority groups as well, although the specifications need to be done differently than it does to whites. So, at this point in the work we're doing, we are very confident to make the following kinds of statements. Some of the key factors like work, like income, over the 25 years, returns wealth rewards very differently for African Americans than it does for whites. For the whole group that we're looking at, a dollar increase in income, each dollar increase in income over the 25 years returns about $5 in wealth to the average white family. That same dollar increase in income, each dollar, returns only 70 cents to the typical African American family. So the blue line heads up more by the same reward on the job and in the paycheck than the red African American line. And indeed, part of the story that is too often undertold, because we do tend to focus on the inequity, is the increase until fairly recently for African Americans. It's just that proportional increase is considerably less. The part of the work that I want to be intentionally hesitant and ambivalent about, because as we keep trying to test it and get it better, has to do with the key drivers. Not for publication, which is indeed why there's not a slide about this. We think we're at the point where we can account for about 60% of the proportional increase in the racial wealth gap, with by far the largest driver being home ownership over the 25 years. The number of years that a family has owned a home over those 25 years, in our estimate, and again, very ambivalent, very hesitant, we keep reworking it, accounts for about 40% of the increase in the racial wealth gap. It's that huge. All right. Now we can stop, and I think we will in the conversation a lot more, because I think it's really important there to think about that. What are the causes of that? How does it come to us? And we, I think, need to start with residential segregation being the linchpin of race relations and the structuring of how different groups accumulate wealth in the United States, and all of the dynamics around that. The other largest drivers, besides home ownership and work, have to do, not surprisingly, with inheritance. Only about, 36% of whites in the sample we were looking at inherited more than $10,000. So most people don't inherit. We have to start there. But 36% of whites do, in comparison to about 7.2% of African Americans. So that's about a 4 or 5-fold differential there. And when whites do inherit, they tend to inherit considerably more dollars than African Americans do when they do inherit. The last largest driver I want to mention at the beginning here is education. And this we captured through college education. And here I think we see the classic racialized puzzle working itself out. I think it does in all the dynamics. But I think we see it perhaps most clearly in education, where a college degree clearly rewards, in terms of wealth and income, by the way, but just we're talking about wealth for the moment, clearly rewards blacks and whites, and is often a good starting point of advice for those of us that have growing children and those of us that teach. There is a huge payoff to a college education. But while that is a positive story for African Americans, the other part of the puzzle is that the same college degree returns considerably more wealth to the typical white family than the typical African American family. And I think part of the story there, which I can delve into perhaps in the conversation, has to do with student debt and what happens what derails students in the first place, the large debt burdens. That's considerably more for African Americans in terms of proportion than for white graduates in the class of 2010 and 2011, for example. Right. In a nutshell, those capture some of the key drivers in what the increase in the racial wealth gap is caused by. That perspective changes our lens, shifts the balance a little bit. We still talk about history, and the sedimentation of inequality is still very critical. But all of those areas I've just talked about have to do with policy and the institutionalization of racialized practice in the United States. That is, dynamics happening here, today, now, in our immediate past, and in our immediate future. For me, that is where I think the great hope of this kind of perspective takes us to. It takes us to looking at policy ways and institutional transformation that can begin to close the racial wealth gap. I believe that it also can help us point to a narrative around how to frame those kinds of issues in ways that we were precisely talking about earlier. And finally, at this point in time, you know what else it also does? It allows people like me and us to interrogate the narrative of others who think they know why the racial wealth gap exists. We can test with evidence child-rearing practices, marital status, and other more culturally and behaviorally oriented so-called causes of the racial wealth gap, and be able to say, you're right, it accounts for something, but in the scheme of things, it's pretty minuscule, and if you're serious about the racial wealth gap, let's focus on the most important drivers. So let me stop there for the moment. I'm sure that a lot more conversation will come up.
Thank you so much for sharing your groundbreaking research and findings with us that we are going to continue to explore. But Barbara, I'd like to turn things over to you now to have you both comment on Tom's findings, but also draw upon your own work to help us understand the drivers of the racial wealth gap.
Thank you, Mariko. Tom, can you pass the clipper? Thank you. First, I wanted to thank Anne and Roger and Kololo for putting together this wonderful. I've been with this group since the beginning in 2004 at Tuskegee, so it's really great to be with everyone and to have a conversation, especially at this really historic juncture. So moving ahead, I wanted to remind people where the minority population in the United States actually is concentrated. So I thought it would be a good reminder to come up with a visual mapping. We find ourselves in interesting places. To reiterate, with respect to the wealth gap, this is a different survey. It's the Survey of Consumer Finances, put out every 3 years by the Board of Governors. And it basically sends us back to the 1900s, or not the 1900s, 1990s, in terms of median wealth. And median wealth is pretty disturbing when it comes to the difference between median and mean. So we really are talking about half of the population actually being below that and half above. So we're talking some big erosion. And finally, I want to bring into the picture, because part of what I'm going to talk about with Tom's results are very important. We are now seeing returning to multi-generational status data that we haven't seen since World War II, since the beginning of the electrification of the United States. We are seeing almost 40% of families, households, now living in multi-generational units. So it's going to have a really big impact with respect to job creation, with respect to housing development, but also with respect to moving forward and what it really means in terms of families and how families arrange themselves. So the questions on the table for me are, why have researchers and academic disciplines failed to fully capture the spillover effects of homeownership? We kind of know always in terms of the monetized value of housing and housing markets. We look at it simply as an investment when we also know that it's a consumption item. But it's more than a consumption item. It also has long-run implications for family stability and for community anchoring. We know that. We haven't done any counterfactuals to actually say, and this is what the returns are on home ownership and what the counterfactual would be if we didn't have that information. So one of the challenges that we have is actually pausing, looking at the positive spillover effects, and wondering what would have been the consequence for this community had there not been home ownership. We haven't done that counterfactual. We need to. It's part of recognizing that home ownership isn't just the investment vehicle, it's also part of stabilizing families, communities, and anchoring our civic engagement. We know from studies that families living in their own homes have a higher probability of children finishing high school. We know that the children growing up in families who own homes have a higher probability of being a homeowner themselves. We also know that children and families growing up in their own homes have higher political participation rates, higher civic engagement. So these are only 3 of the many positive spillover effects of homeownership. And we're looking at homeownership only in terms of investment. So this is one of our challenges. The other challenge is what the role will be for our institutions that we've taken for granted for a very long time. Now that we've had the Great Recession, now that we're beginning to look at a 21st landscape, not only in job creation, but in job training and in job mobility, we're also looking at new ways of facing the housing market and the recovery of the housing market. What are we going to be asking of our institutions? Are we going to be asking them to be siloized like they have in the past? Or will we be asking them to be more comprehensive in terms of what kind of services they deliver? Finally, I submit that we're in a new age of little data and big data. We've just come off the election where everybody was looking at the polls, if not every day, every other day. And we have become a very data-oriented society. We produce it, we analyze it, we now have become almost a consumer, expert on dashboard analytics in one way or another. So this is a time to now be using data to benefit our communities, and we can be doing it in real time. So one way that our communities can actually advocate for themselves is to have the evidence in a timely way and not have to wait 5 years to get the evidence. This is about helping communities, in a sense, have a little bit of what the campaign was all about. How do you get the information? How do you implement it? And how do you get the outcomes? So, communities at the table is part of what I think this conversation is about and the wealth divide is about. Because it's in communities where the wealth erosion has happened. So with that, I kind of close off and open the floor.
Hi, so my question kind of relates to a previous one about income. I was wondering, over recent decades, really, we've seen an increase in income inequality, and I think also an increase in wealth inequality. And I was wondering if any of the panelists can kind of connect us, do a sort of a race and class analysis to help us understand how these things might be connected to each other. And also, I guess more broadly, I guess the drivers of that, and how can we work to both reduce wealth inequality generally and also income inequality generally, and which I presume would have beneficial effects in terms of reducing the racial wealth divide. But it's a question.
Thank you for that set of questions. So the second largest key driver in the increase in the racial wealth gap has to do with dynamics around work and pay. It's been, we clearly need to identify it and elevate it, and to think very seriously about the kinds of policies that would remedy that. I think it certainly in that basket has to do with a living wage, far beyond the minimum wage. But I also think it has to do with benefits, especially around retirement security, health care benefits, and others as well. I don't remember the exact dating on this, and maybe my colleague at the Fed will remember. I don't want to put her on the spot. But if we were to look at a graph around worker productivity, post-World War II worker productivity, in the period right after World War II, there's a near doubling of productivity in the United States. And for the most part, that productivity is shared. The living standard of most groups, whether it's racial, ethnic, age, gender, nearly doubles between about 1950 and the late 1960s. Now, the middle story I want to skip over, but it's the last part of the story that we're in, where 0% of the productivity has been distributed through the wage or through wealth to anybody outside of the top 1%. And that happens out of diminishing power of unions, policies, tax preferential policies around the wealthy, around capital gains, how interest is treated, all of those kinds of policies that were changed from previous eras to specifically benefit those at the very top. So the stagnation, if you will, in the living standard of of typical American families and workers is not out of lack of productivity. It's lack of how that productivity has been shared. It's been going to essentially the very, very top 1% again. Those are questions around, or lack of questions around labor economics, around the ability to make that distribution much more equitable, however we want to define that.
And we also have, I think, a disconnect, and it's a conversation that I continue to have with my colleagues in communications and in marketing. There was, I think, a legacy in a time when the U.S. workforce understood that it was also a consumer. And now we tend to have a disconnect between the consumer identity and the worker identity. And so they don't recognize in one person the connection between what you're buying at Walmart is also going to have an impact on what you're going to be bringing home. And if part of free enterprise is about price decreases, then we're going to see this reflected also in the workers' wage scale. Now, another issue that we haven't seen is since the 1960s, occupational status and how you value that with respect to where it's placed in the economic sector and the industry hasn't been revisited. And I submit, I really believe that this is a time that we need to be rethinking this, especially after 9/11, is that we have food security. And this is one job sector that's not, that can't be exported. So those who work in the food sector industry should get a national security premium precisely because this is an area, provided they can keep the food sources safe. So I think we need to be thinking outside of the box with respect to occupational status. The baby boomers are going to mean that we're going to have a lot of elder care. That too cannot be exported somewhere else to have it happen. So the elder care worker is going to become really crucial to our economy. So how are we going to value that? So I think there's times right now that we have some flexibility to revisit what do occupations mean, what do they entail, and looking forward, what kind of living wage are they going to pay?
I'm going to interject my moderator status, and I promise I've not forgotten about you. I just want to make a couple comments about income and the importance of the income inequality gap. We should absolutely be paying attention to income inequality. It no doubt affects wealth inequality. But I do think that there are some nuances that we want to think about when we're thinking about sort of that relationship. And while income is necessary, and equalizing income among women and men and people of color and whites is absolutely critical, we need to continue to focus our attentions on these areas. I think it's appalling, personally, that we have not been able to pass the Paycheck Fairness Act, for example, despite 2 attempts. Maybe the 3rd time is the charm. However, one thing we do need to keep our attention on is that closing the income gap will not close the wealth gap. It's absolutely important that we focus on it, but we can't stop there. We have to take it to the next step. And I think the reason for that, the panel has highlighted the effects of inheritance. That even if you have 2 people with the same incomes, if you have someone inheriting, from past discrimination, that will, of course, impact their ability to build wealth. But also central to the women's wealth gap and to the racial wealth gap is the fact that women, in some instances, have nearly closed the wage gap for some groups of women, not all women, but yet a huge wealth gap remains. And that's because women are more likely to have custody of children, and they cannot save as much if they're supporting more than one person on their income, in addition to all of these other institutional factors that we pointed to. And that's actually central to closing the racial wealth gap as well, because right now, if you look at demographic differences for communities of color versus, white communities, although that's a color too, women of color are disproportionately or more likely to be single parents. And so the gender wealth gap is actually a central part of the racial wealth gap as well. And so absolutely, we need to focus on that, but we need to also then focus on closing the wealth gap as well. Woman, thank you. You waited so patiently.
Thank you. Very interesting. The one thing I feel that's missing from this conversation is the educational gap. I mean, as long as there's an educational gap, there is going to be an income gap. And when we look at the history of public education in the world, not just America, going back to Persia, when Germany was called Persia, public education was introduced so that there would be a gap to make sure that people would be educated or schooled. I don't like to use the word educated, but schooled to believe or to accept a status as workers. And the very nature of capitalism encourages one group to be unequal to another group and supports a system of wealth for people at the top. So I think the conversation has to also include the educational gap. If you look at the income gap, usually the people with the lower income, excepting women to some degree, if you look at the public education system, I'm from the South, from Alabama, and there are drastic differences. Separate and unequal education is still persistent. That's the first point. And the question I wanted to ask, dealing with housing and creating wealth, there are 2 things, and I agree with the gentleman over here, completely equalizing wealth is fantasy land to me. But there are things we can do, I think, to minimize the income gap. A few years ago, if you were on Section 8, you could buy that Section 8 house. What happened to that policy? Why? That's something very simple that can be pushed from a policy stand, especially with the Obama administration. If the government's going to give a landowner $500 to rent, why not give that $500 for that low-income person to own that house? That's a policy change. The second thing I want to raise, women, primarily women raising children, under the whole welfare reform plan, cannot go to school full-time and get assistance from the government. In Alabama, a woman gets $190 a month. She's required to work 30 hours a week. That's slave labor. It would increase or decrease the income gap if she was allowed to go to school full time, get the public assistance so that she would be in a better position to get a decent job. And so my question is there any opportunity for people in this room to identify things that are seemingly simple like that? For let's face it, most low-income people have no wealth to pass on. So, and the second thing, someone made the point that, you know, a few years ago colleges were free, but because of the whole testing issue and the educational gap, or what I call the preparation gap, not the achievement gap, many low-income people, especially people of color, were not able to get those scholarships or go to school free anyway. So if I could get the panel's response to those three issues.
Start.
Do you want to respond to that?
Oh, I was looking over to you to respond first. I mean, I guess there's so many interesting points there. I mean, of course, we have to care about the education gap. I think that's absolutely critical. These are all pieces of the puzzle, and I think that actually that's a perfect segue to many of the discussions that we're going to be having tomorrow, to the importance of the education gap in helping to drive the racial wealth gap. And so I think that, you know, these are absolutely important factors that you're pointing to. Disparities, the separate and unequal, I think also goes back to the issue of residential segregation as well, and the inequities in resources that is distributed across communities based primarily on property taxes. So I guess I'm agreeing with you.
So let me just add a word or two, if you don't mind. For a lot of reasons, education is very important for the society. If we're, among other things, going to compete in a 21st century world, there's a lot more civic education, a lot more critical thinking education that needs to be done. And we are woefully behind, I think, as a society with that, with where the focus has gone very far astray to sort of the high stakes testing, which takes us away from those other values that education serve. But it's also the case that education, college education in particular, is one of the top three drivers of the increasing racial wealth gap. It's a key driver of the increasing income inequality as well. I think everybody understands, I don't think there's been a time in American history where education, a college education, and or technical education has been as important as it is today, right? Which makes getting communities and families to those institutions in a prepared way that they can access it and be able to pay for it and not come out of it with huge amounts of debt. It's not just about access, it's about what happens at the other end as well. Among other things, we know that the prime reason that African Americans leave college is for work. It's financial consideration. It's not lack of ability to work hard or anything like that. Finally, there are a lot. I'm not sure about your Section 8 reference. Somebody else would have to pick up on that maybe after the session. I would mention, however, that there's a policy called family self-sufficiency that I think is one of the more beautiful mechanisms and more progressive policy mechanisms in the United States today that very few people know about or understand or have access to. Essentially, as somebody's income at work increases, instead of their rent going up in subsidized housing in any way, it can be escrowed, where essentially half of that is put into a pot of money that they can access if they complete the program, and it's theirs free and clear after they complete that program. In the interviews we have done with families, we first started to interview in 1998. There's a family in Los Angeles that when we first interviewed her, she was on, then it was welfare. It had just become TANF. she became a homeowner because she worked, increased her pay at work, and was able to put enough money aside in that escrow account where she purchased a home for herself, used that as a starter home, if you will, and then because she wanted a better school system for her kids, which is why most moderate income African Americans move out of their community, is for better education for their kids and or a safer community. She moved for those reasons to a suburb far outside of Los Angeles. But it all started for her with the Family Self-Sufficiency Program, and it got her, provided that pathway, that wealth escalator, as Mariko would call it in that instance.
I think that we also have something that we don't recognize as part of our asset inheritance that's a little bit different that we bring to the table. We constantly monetize the notion of wealth, and we use a yardstick that exists kind of out there. And when we began to look at our communities, having grown up as a youth translator, the people who took care of me didn't have an education. One was illiterate, one could read and write. But the cultural capital they passed on is the wealth that allowed me to be very resilient in terms of moving through a different educational system and formulating a lot of aspirations. So I question our notion of only monetized wealth. I think our wealth comes in such a variety of different kind of capitals. Here's social capital, cultural capital, the human capital part of it. And I think that those legacies are something that we haven't really spoken of. They're not part of our narrative, and we need to bring them in because they are part of the toolkit that we use that ends up contributing to the monetized wealth that we end up accumulating.
We have time for one final question, and I guess they gave the mic. Is that Jim back there? I'm sorry, I forgot my glasses. This is really embarrassing.
Okay, so just a really quick comment. First of all, thank you, Jim Carr, Opportunity Agenda, Mariko, Tom, and now that I know, Barbie. It's never going away. Remember, we meet every year, Barbie. So just real quickly, a couple of comments. One, I just want to tie something that Derek and Sandy touched upon, which I think is really important, which is we could talk about all the solutions in the world, but we won't have a solution to closing the racial wealth gap until we've inspired those who actually have the wealth to want to help us close that gap. And it seems that one of the ways to do it is to show research that shows there's a real benefit to everyone of closing it. And one of the pieces of research I just wanted to point out was, I wish I could remember the details, I've actually been trying to find it, was done by HUD. I don't know if they did it in-house or they contracted it. What was some of the most brilliant research I think I've seen yet in motivating an industry to change its behavior, and it was under Cisneros around maybe 15 years ago, and it showed the incremental value to the economy of closing the homeownership gap. And by doing that, it didn't imply or suggest any loss for homeowners currently. It actually showed a gain for the entire economy, which implied jobs and a much more rich environment. I say that because the thing that I noticed that has been most strikingly missing from the conversation, and I mean from all of the conversation, not the presenters, is it's been alluded to, which is the growing shares of population of people of color. And so to that, I would say, in terms of, Mariko, your explicit question of what are the spillover effects, it would seem that we should be able to, and we should be generating those spillover effects that are very positive, that show what is the increase of, for example, enhancing the income of people of color, enhancing the wealth, enhancing home ownership, enhancing holdings of say, all sorts of pension funds. And I don't mean pension, quote unquote, I mean like, the retirement funds, because that would show real value to the economy, GDP. The flip side of it would be research like yours, Tom, that actually shows these growing wealth gaps, but connects those wealth gaps to population shares and GDP specifically, that show that GDP is actually going to continue to get smaller and smaller as that wealth continues to be more isolated in the hands of few. At least it seems that that would be the case, and certainly it appears to be the case right now. And then the final thing, I had several comments, but I'll just close with this last one, which is we have to also focus on protecting the wealth. And Barbara alluded to that in terms of liens property tax liens. But one of the things we haven't really talked about is, maybe we'll do it tomorrow, is the foreclosure crisis. And so a failure to protect black wealth, Asian wealth, Latino wealth, Native American wealth in the middle of the foreclosure crisis is just amazing. And we shouldn't forget that, because we've got over almost 3.5 million properties that are seriously delinquent heading into the foreclosure process. And some research I did showed that high-income African American and Latinos are actually experiencing foreclosure in 3 separate cities that we tested at a greater rate than average income whites, even when all things are held constant, including credit score and income, which suggests that there are other systemic things happening within the financial system that's actually taking their property from them. Access to bankruptcy, we know a recent study earlier this year showed that African Americans are steered to the least likely, most expensive and least productive forms of bankruptcy protection. And then on the whole financial services arena, we haven't talked about access to basic financial services. I think that's also another critical area that needs to be put up on, into this conversation.
Thank you. I hope you will all join me in expressing our gratitude to our wonderful panelists for their pioneering work and for leading us into such a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
And let's also please give a big hand to Mariko for her excellent moderation. Thank you, Mariko. And also to Alexis and Lorena for helping us cap off a fantastic start to our conference. I just have a couple of announcements. The reception has been moved from my perspective, unfortunately. Apparently it's too windy by the pool. So we will be up at the Vista room on the 18th floor. And we haven't seen it, but hopefully it's a nice vista. There will be hors d'oeuvres and drinks. Dinner, if you need dinner afterwards, it will be on your own. So please use that opportunity to continue the conversation that we started today. As Mariko mentioned, we will have opportunities tomorrow afternoon for deep dives into each of, 3 of the factors that Tom mentioned, including income, and also education and homeownership. Tomorrow, breakfast will start at 7.